A disruptive tourist believed his aggressive dog could rattle a royal guard, thinking fear would give him control. But the moment he unleashed the animal, he realized too late that he was the one who had lost control. What followed left the entire crowd absolutely speechless. This is how it all happened. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and be sure to subscribe. Tomorrow, at the same time, we'll bring you another unforgettable story that showcases the Royal Guard's unwavering bravery and discipline. You won't want to miss it. There are moments in life that expose the true character of people, moments when masks fall away and we see who someone really is underneath. What I'm about to share with you happened on a cold November morning in 2023, right in the heart of London. And it's a story that will stay with you long after I finish telling it. My name doesn't matter for this tale, but what does matter is that I've spent the better part of my career documenting human behavior at its most extreme. I've witnessed acts of incredible kindness and unspeakable cruelty, often within the same day. But this particular incident stands out because it perfectly illustrates the collision between two entirely different philosophies of power. The setting was Buckingham Palace, that magnificent symbol of British heritage that draws millions of visitors each year. People come from every corner of the globe to witness the pageantry, to photograph the guards in their iconic red tunics, and to feel connected to centuries of tradition. Most visitors are respectful, even reverent. They understand they're witnessing something special, something that connects them to history itself. But not everyone who visits understands or respects what they're seeing. Some people see tradition as weakness, discipline as an invitation to test boundaries. And on this particular morning, one such person decided to push those boundaries in a way that would shock everyone present. The man's name was Marcus Thompson, though he went by Tank among his circle of drinking buddies back in Manchester. At 39 years old, Tank had perfected the art of intimidation. He stood 6'2" with the kind of bulk that came from years of construction work and countless hours in seedy gyms. His arms were covered in tattoos that told the story of a life lived on the edges of society, prison ink mixed with professional work, creating a visual narrative of someone who'd seen both sides of the law. Tank didn't travel alone. His constant companion was a massive Rottweiler named Brutus, and together they formed one of the most feared pairs in their neighborhood. The dog had been trained using methods that would make any legitimate animal behaviorist sick to their stomach. This wasn't training in any real sense, it was systematic conditioning designed to turn a naturally loyal animal into a weapon of intimidation. The morning had started peacefully enough. By 9 a.m., the usual crowd of tourists had gathered around the palace gates, cameras ready, guidebooks in hand. There were families from Germany excitedly explaining the history to their children, a group of American college students planning their photo opportunities, and elderly couples from various corners of the Commonwealth quietly appreciating the spectacle. Standing at his post was Lance Corporal David Morrison, a 26-year-old member of the Grenadier Guards who had earned his position through years of exemplary service. Morrison wasn't just any soldier, he was a decorated veteran who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan, where he'd learned that true strength often meant standing perfectly still while chaos erupted around you. The training to become a Royal Guard is incredibly rigorous. These men are selected not just for their military prowess, but for their mental fortitude. They must be able to remain motionless for hours at a time, ignoring everything from tourist taunts to genuine emergencies unless specifically authorized to respond. It's a test of will that breaks many candidates, but those who succeed represent the absolute pinnacle of military discipline. Morrison had been at his post since dawn, and he'd already weathered the usual challenges that come with the job. A group of teenagers had spent 30 minutes trying to make him smile. A street performer had set up uncomfortably close hoping to benefit from the tourist traffic, and at least a dozen people had asked him direct questions that he was duty-bound to ignore. Through it all, Morrison maintained the perfect posture that had been drilled into him during months of specialized training. His eyes remained fixed on a distant point, his breathing was controlled and steady, and his mind was focused on the honor of representing the crown. This wasn't just a job for him, it was a calling, a way of serving something greater than himself. But around 10:30 a.m., the peaceful morning atmosphere began to change. There was a shift in the crowd's energy, a ripple of unease that spread through the assembled tourists like a wave. People began moving away from a particular area. Parents instinctively pulled their children closer, and even the most oblivious visitors seemed to sense that something was wrong. Tank emerged from the underground station like a storm cloud rolling across a clear sky. He walked with the swagger of someone who had spent years using his physical presence to get what he wanted. His clothing was deliberately intimidating, a leather jacket covered in patches from various motorcycle clubs, boots that had clearly seen their share of violence, and a chain wallet that rattled with each step. But it was Brutus who truly commanded attention. The Rottweiler moved with the controlled aggression of a predator, his massive head scanning the crowd for potential threats. The dog's conditioning had taught him to view every stranger as an enemy, every sudden movement as a reason to attack. His low growl was constant, a rumbling warning that kept people at a safe distance. Tank fed off the fear his presence created. You could see it in his eyes, the satisfaction he felt when parents hurried their children away, the pleasure he took in watching tourists cross the street to avoid him. This was his drug, his addiction to the power that came from making others afraid. As they moved through the crowd, Tank would deliberately jerk Brutus's heavy chain leash, causing the dog to lunge at passing pedestrians. Each time someone jumped back in terror, Tank would laugh, a harsh, bitter sound that spoke of a man who had long ago lost any empathy for his fellow human beings. A young mother pushing a stroller quickly changed direction when she saw them approaching. An elderly gentleman with a walking stick pressed himself against a wall to let them pass. Even the street vendors who usually worked the area began packing up their goods, recognizing trouble when they saw it. Tank's reputation preceded him wherever he went. Back in Manchester, entire pubs would empty when he walked in with Brutus. Shop owners would close early rather than risk a confrontation. He'd been banned from most public spaces in his hometown. But London was different. London was full of soft tourists who didn't know what real danger looked like. But as Tank surveyed the crowd with his predator's eyes, he spotted something that made his cruel smile falter just slightly. There, standing in perfect stillness, was Lance Corporal Morrison. The guard hadn't moved, hadn't reacted to the approaching threat, hadn't even seemed to notice that the most dangerous man in the area was heading straight for him. Tank's psychology was built on dominance and control. He'd learned early in life that violence, or the threat of violence, could get him almost anything he wanted. Teachers had been afraid of him, employers had walked on eggshells around him, and even police officers had sometimes chosen to look the other way, rather than deal with his explosive temper. But here was the soldier, this symbol of everything Tank despised about authority and order, treating him like he was invisible. It was an insult that Tank's ego simply couldn't tolerate. In his twisted worldview, respect came through fear, and fear came through violence. If someone wasn't afraid of him, it meant they hadn't yet learned the lesson he was prepared to teach. Tank began moving toward Morrison with deliberate intent, Brutus matching his master's aggressive energy step for step. The crowd around them continued to disperse, sensing the building tension even if they couldn't articulate exactly what was wrong. Several tourists had already started recording with their phones, that modern instinct to document drama as it unfolds. "Oi," Tank called out, his voice carrying the harsh accent of Manchester's roughest neighborhoods. "Yeah, you in the ridiculous hat, I'm talking to you, mate." He was still about 20 feet away, but his voice was loud enough to draw attention from across the courtyard. Morrison, of course, maintained his stoic silence. This wasn't arrogance or disrespect, it was duty. He'd sworn an oath to maintain his post regardless of distractions, and that oath meant something to him. He'd stood guard in Afghanistan while mortar rounds exploded nearby. He'd maintained discipline during riots and protests, and he wasn't about to break now because of one loud tourist. Tank's frustration was visible in his body language. His shoulders tensed, his fists clenched, and Brutus responded to his master's rising aggression by growling louder and straining harder against the chain. The dog had been conditioned to mirror Tank's emotional state, and right now, that emotional state was rapidly approaching dangerous territory. "What's wrong with you?" Tank snarled, closing the distance between them. "Too good to talk to regular people? Think you're some kind of toy soldier?" His voice was getting louder, more aggressive, drawing the attention of everyone in the immediate area. The thing about professional soldiers is that they're trained to assess threats constantly. Morrison might have appeared motionless to the casual observer, but his mind was working. He'd already identified Tank as a potential problem, cataloged the presence of the dog, and noted the positions of nearby civilians. He wasn't ignoring the situation, he was monitoring it while maintaining his official duties. Tank's rage was building like pressure in a boiler. He'd spent his entire adult life terrifying people into submission, and this guard's silence was challenging everything he believed about power and dominance. The gathered tourists were watching, now, some with obvious concern, Others with the morbid curiosity that draws people to car accidents and public confrontations. "You think you're better than me," Tank spat, moving close enough that Morrison could probably smell the alcohol on his breath. "You think that fancy costume makes you tough?" He was deliberately invading the guard's personal space, using his bulk to try to intimidate someone who had faced down Taliban fighters and roadside bombs. Brutus was now in full threat mode, his barks echoing off the palace walls as he sensed his master's escalating anger. The dog's conditioning had taught him that when Tank was angry, violence usually followed, and he was preparing himself to be unleashed on whatever target his master chose. Still, Morrison didn't move. His breathing remained controlled, his posture perfect, his eyes fixed on that distant point that had become his anchor during countless hours of guard duty. This wasn't stubbornness, it was discipline of the highest order, the kind that's forged in combat and refined through years of service. Inspector Rachel Hayes of the Metropolitan Police later told me that this was the critical moment, when the situation could have gone in several different directions. If Tank had been just another drunk tourist, he might have eventually lost interest and moved on. Security officers were already being alerted to the disturbance, and they would have handled it through standard procedures. But Tank wasn't just drunk, he was a predator who had encountered something he couldn't immediately dominate, and that made him exponentially more dangerous. His entire identity was built on being the most feared person in any given situation, and Morrison's calm professionalism was challenging that identity at its core. Right then, Tank muttered, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that those closest to him could barely hear. "If you won't show me respect, maybe you'll show it to Brutus." His hands moved to the heavy chain that kept the Rottweiler in check, and several tourists realized what was about to happen and began backing away quickly. The dog had been systematically trained to attack on command, to view Tank's enemies as his own, and to use his considerable size and strength to neutralize threats. But underneath all that conditioning, Brutus was still just an animal who had been twisted by years of abuse into something he was never meant to be. The moment Tank released that chain, everything changed with terrifying speed. Brutus, freed from his restraint, immediately focused on the target his master had been threatening. To the dog's conditioned mind, this was exactly what he'd been trained for: eliminate the threat, please the alpha, do what had been beaten into him since he was a puppy. The courtyard erupted in chaos as people scattered in every direction. Parents scooped up children and ran for cover. Elderly tourists stumbled in their haste to get away, and even the street performers who had been working the area abandoned their equipment and fled. In the space of perhaps 5 seconds, a peaceful morning had become a scene of panic and terror. Brutus launched himself at Morrison with all the power that a 130-pound trained attack dog could muster. His jaws were open, his eyes were wild with conditioned rage, and he was moving with the kind of focused violence that would have overwhelmed anyone who wasn't prepared for it. But Morrison was prepared. This wasn't just some ceremonial guard playing dress-up for tourists. This was a combat veteran who had survived firefights in some of the world's most dangerous places. He'd been trained in close-quarters combat, threat neutralization, and the kind of split-second decision-making that keeps soldiers alive in war zones. What happened next was so fast that most witnesses didn't see the details. Morrison's response was a masterpiece of controlled violence, efficient, precise, and utterly devastating. As Brutus lunged, Morrison sidestepped with perfect timing, his hands moving with the practiced skill of someone who had trained for exactly this kind of situation. Instead of trying to fight the dog's momentum, Morrison redirected it. He grabbed Brutus's collar mid-leap and used the animal's own weight and speed against him, sending the dog tumbling harmlessly to the ground. It was a technique that required incredible timing and strength, but Morrison executed it flawlessly. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds, but in that brief moment, Morrison had demonstrated the difference between real strength and the crude intimidation that Tank had mistaken for power. The dog was neutralized, the crowd was safe, and the guard had done it all without breaking his stoic expression. Tank's face went through a remarkable transformation as he watched his supposedly unstoppable weapon neutralized by a man who hadn't even broken a sweat. Confusion gave way to disbelief, then to a rage so pure and primal that it transformed his features into something almost inhuman. "You bastard!" Tank roared, charging forward with his fists raised and his face twisted with fury. "You hurt my dog." In his delusional mind, he was somehow the victim in this situation, the wronged party who had been attacked by an aggressive soldier. But if Tank thought he was going to catch Morrison off guard, He was about to receive an education in what real combat training looked like. The guard had been prepared for the possibility of multiple threats. Its standard procedure when dealing with aggressive individuals and their animals. Before Tank could take more than 3 steps, 2 additional guards appeared with the kind of coordinated precision that speaks 2 years of training together. The Royal Guards don't work in isolation, they're part of a unit, and when one guard is threatened, the others respond immediately and overwhelmingly. Tank found himself facing 3 combat veterans who moved with the controlled aggression of professional soldiers. These weren't weakened warriors or security guards, they were elite military personnel who had earned their positions through years of service and were prepared to use whatever force was necessary to protect their post and the public. The sound of sirens was already growing louder in the distance. The Metropolitan Police don't take chances when it comes to incidents near royal properties, and multiple units were already responding to what dispatch had initially reported as an assault on Royal Guard. Tank was about to discover that attacking a member of the Queen's Guard carries far more serious consequences than intimidating random civilians. "This is illegal," Tank screamed as the guards moved to restrain him. "You can't touch me. I'm a British citizen. He attacked my dog." His protests grew more desperate as he realized that his usual intimidation tactics weren't working on people who were trained to deal with actual dangerous situations. Brutus, meanwhile, was lying on the ground looking confused and disoriented. The dog's conditioning had taught him to attack on command, but he'd never encountered someone who could neutralize him so efficiently. For perhaps the first time in years, the animal was experiencing something other than the constant aggression that had been beaten into him. The police response was swift and overwhelming. Within minutes, the scene was swarming with officers from multiple units, uniformed constables, specialist dog handlers, and senior detectives who understood the serious nature of any threat to Royal Guards. Tank's loud protests about his rights were falling on deaf ears as he was efficiently handcuffed and processed. Chief Inspector Margaret Collins was the senior officer who took charge of the scene. She'd been working Westminster for nearly 2 decades and had seen her share of incidents involving tourists and the Royal Guards. But this was different. This wasn't just a drunk tourist getting too close or a protester making a statement. This was a deliberate assault using an animal as a weapon. The man was completely detached from reality. Collins told me months later. He genuinely seemed to believe that he was the victim, that somehow the guard had initiated the violence. He kept demanding to know why we weren't arresting the soldier. It was like he inhabited a completely different version of reality. The evidence against Tank was overwhelming. Dozens of tourists had recorded the incident on their phones, providing multiple angles of the attack and Morrison's response. Witness statements were consistent. Tank had deliberately released his dog on a Royal Guard, and the guard had responded with appropriate force to protect himself and the public. But the situation with Brutus was more complex. The dog was clearly dangerous, but animal welfare specialists could see that his aggression was the result of systematic abuse, rather than natural temperament. Dr. Amanda Foster, a veterinary behaviorist who was called to assess the situation, recognized the signs of what she called weaponization syndrome. This wasn't a naturally aggressive animal, Dr. Foster explained to me. This was a dog that had been systematically conditioned to view the world as hostile. The owner had essentially turned what should have been a loyal family pet into a living weapon. It was one of the most heartbreaking cases of animal abuse I'd ever seen. The decision was made to remove Brutus from Tank's custody immediately. The dog would be taken to a specialized facility, where experts would attempt to undo years of conditioning and abuse. It would be a long and difficult process, but there was hope that the animal could eventually be rehabilitated. As for Morrison, he had calmly resumed his post as if nothing had happened. His uniform was still immaculate, his posture was still perfect, and his expression remained stoically neutral. The only sign that anything unusual had occurred was the slight dishevelment of his white gloves where he'd briefly handled the attacking dog. The legal proceedings against Tank were handled with the full weight of the British justice system. Assault on a Royal Guard is treated as a serious offense, and Tank's extensive criminal record ensured that he would face the maximum penalties available. The Crown Prosecution Service assigned their most experienced prosecutors to the case, treating it as a matter of national security. The trial, which took place for months later, was a showcase of overwhelming evidence. The prosecution presented video footage from multiple angles, testimony from dozens of witnesses, and expert analysis of Brutus's condition that painted a clear picture of systematic animal abuse. Stretching back years, Tank's defense attorney, clearly working with limited options, tried to argue that his client had been provoked by the guard's aggressive stance, and that releasing the dog had been a defensive action. The strategy was doomed from the start. The evidence clearly showed Tank as the aggressor and Morrison as someone who had responded appropriately to a deadly threat. "Mr. Thompson," the judge said during sentencing, "you brought what you had deliberately turned into a weapon into a crowded public space, and used it to attack a member of Her Majesty's forces. This was not a moment of poor judgment. This was a calculated act of violence that endangered innocent people and violated the most basic principles of civilized society." Tank was sentenced to 4 years in prison, given a lifetime ban on owning animals, and ordered to pay substantial restitution to cover Brutus's rehabilitation costs. Upon his release, he would be prohibited from entering the Westminster area and would face enhanced penalties for any future criminal activity. The case attracted significant media attention throughout the UK. Headlines like "Bully's dog attack backfires spectacularly" and "Royal Guard demonstrates true meaning of strength" dominated the tabloids for weeks. But beyond the sensationalism, the incident had highlighted serious issues about animal welfare and the problem of people who abuse pets as tools of intimidation. Morrison, true to military tradition, declined all media requests and never made any public statements about the incident. His commanding officer released a brief statement praising his exemplary conduct under extraordinary circumstances, but Morrison himself remained silent. For him, it had simply been another day of doing his duty. The story of Brutus's rehabilitation became a remarkable tale of recovery and redemption. Dr. Foster and her team worked tirelessly to undo the damage that Tank had inflicted on the dog's psyche. It was delicate work that required enormous patience and expertise. The biggest challenge was teaching Brutus that not every human was a threat. Dr. Foster explained, he'd been conditioned to view people as either enemies to be attacked or masters to be feared. We had to help him discover that humans could be sources of comfort and security, not just violence and intimidation. The rehabilitation process was painstaking. Brutus had to learn that aggression wouldn't be rewarded, that other animals weren't automatically threats, and that the world could be a safe place. It involved careful desensitization therapy, positive reinforcement training, and countless hours of patient work by dedicated professionals. Progress was slow but steady. After months of intensive therapy, Brutus began to show signs of the dog he could have been if he'd been raised with love instead of violence. He learned to play with toys, to enjoy gentle petting, and to interact peacefully with other animals. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Eventually, after nearly a year of rehabilitation, Brutus was ready for adoption. The family selected to take him was carefully chosen experienced dog owners who understood his history and were committed to continuing his recovery. They renamed him Bruno and gave him the loving home he'd never had. The last update I received about Bruno was entirely positive. He'd become a beloved family pet who enjoyed playing with children and had formed a close bond with his new owner's elderly cat. The aggressive, dangerous animal that Tank had created was gone, replaced by a gentle companion who finally understood what it meant to be loved. Tank, meanwhile, served his full sentence and was quietly released in 2027. Prison had done little to change his fundamental nature, and those who knew him doubted that he'd learned anything meaningful from his experience. Some people, unfortunately, seem incapable of genuine transformation. As I conclude this account, I'm struck by what it reveals about the fundamental nature of strength and power. Tank Thompson believed that might made right, that intimidation and violence were the keys to respect and control. He'd built his entire identity around being the most feared person in any room, and he'd turned an innocent animal into a weapon to support that twisted philosophy. Lance Corporal Morrison represented something entirely different: true strength that comes from discipline, training, and dedication to something greater than oneself. His power wasn't derived from making others afraid. It came from his commitment to duty, his years of service, and his absolute mastery of his craft. The contrast between these two men couldn't have been starker. Tank's crude violence was defeated by Morrison's professional competence in a matter of seconds. The bully who had terrorized an entire neighborhood was neutralized by a soldier who never even broke his stoic expression. But perhaps the most important lesson comes from Bruno's story. It reminds us that aggression and violence are usually learned behaviors, not inevitable traits. The dog that had been turned into a weapon became a beloved family pet when given the chance to heal and grow. The incident at Buckingham Palace lasted only a few minutes, But its impact continued for years. It changed lives, exposed important truths about human nature, and ultimately demonstrated that actions have consequences sometimes far more severe than we anticipate. Morrison continued his service with distinction and eventually transitioned to a successful career in private security. He never spoke publicly about that November morning, but his actions spoke volumes about character, duty, and the quiet strength that comes from knowing who you are and what you stand for. And somewhere in a comfortable home in the English countryside, a dog named Bruno sleeps peacefully, finally free from the nightmare that one man's cruelty had created for him. In the end, that might be the most important victory of all, proof that with patience, skill, and compassion, even the most damaged souls can find their way back to the light. The tourists still gather at Buckingham Palace every day, and the guards still maintain their silent vigil. But those who witnessed what happened that November morning learned something valuable about the true meaning of strength, the importance of discipline, and the difference between power and mere intimidation. This story endures not just because of its dramatic elements, but because of the timeless truths it reveals about human nature and the choices we make that define who we are.